Hello and welcome to an absolutely huge video. This is gonna be very long, but I feel like it's a nice little idea and something I wanted to do for a long time. So, well, here we go. Today I'll rank every racetrack that has ever been in a Codemasters Formula 1 game, apart from the one in 2009, which was only available for PSP and Wii, and it was a little, well, let's just say clunky. And I'll be judging this based on how they feel to drive and race on in the game, not how they are in real life and how real races usually are there. And of course I should not need to say that, but I better do. This is my personal opinion, and if you don't agree with me, you can go fuck off. Well, of course not. If you don't agree with me, just share your thoughts in the comments and give me your ratings as well. And now, since this video will be long enough anyway, without further ado, let's freaking go. We're going through this in alphabetical order, so naturally the first track we'll judge is where there's usually the season opener as well, Australia. The Istanbul Park Circuit in Melbourne has been in every F1 game to date, and it's always a blast to drive there. It has just the right balance between challenging to get a perfect lap and fun to race on with its many fast turns, and of course the highlight of turn 11 and 12. They will catch you out if you overdo it just a bit too much, but if you nail them, they're an absolute blast, and you may even get a good run at cars ahead into turn 13, which is one of the greatest overtaking spots on the track apart from turns 1 and 3. This maybe is one of the bigger flaws, that overtaking here is pretty hard, for which the painfully slow penultimate and strange last corner don't help, as they may interrupt any good run you had on the car ahead, so this makes it only get an A from me. Next one up, we're visiting Austria and the Red Bull Ring. And this one has quite some opposite issues. It's a track that's great for racing, as there's overtaking opportunities aplenty, on which I already had some great battles, especially up to turn 3, and then for a second chance or maybe a counter-attack into turn 4, and the following corners you may even still be side by side. The racing aspect here is absolutely terrific, and it's always fun to come here for that, but, well, if you're just driving this track alone in time trial, or in no man's land in a race, or, well, far up the top, it gets kinda boring after some laps, and it's not really that challenging, apart from hitting the accelerator after turn 3 if you're driving without traction control. This one might catch you out, but everything else is pretty straightforward. But the great racing and the fun to drive turns 6, 7 and 8 still secure it another A. Next we're at Azerbaijan, and this is the first proper street circuit with little to no runoff and concrete walls as track limits, unlike Australia where there's still lots of runoff in most turns. And this one is quite hard to judge for me, as racing there is very good for a street circuit like that. It may even be the best street circuit to race against other people because of its high speed and hard braking zones, but it is a lot of 90-degree corners for the most part of the track that are all kinda samey. Then of course after a ton of 90-degree corners comes the castle section, which is the narrowest part of the whole calendar, and that one is challenging of course, but not in a good way, and rather in an annoying way. The bit that follows is quite fun again, and then it's another 90-degree corner and flat out all the way to the finish line. Well, I mean, it's good, but it's not breathtaking. It's still a street track with a lot of character, and I enjoy going through Baku's old town with all of those modern buildings in the backdrop, and, well, it's already an iconic and fun venue, so I'm still going with a B. Next one up we have Bahrain. This is the original track in the Middle East for Formula 1, and, well, it should have remained the only one there as well. Apart from the human rights situation in these countries, other countries there haven't really produced good racetracks either after Bahrain. The Bahrain International Circuit is a very good racetrack for me. It has pretty much everything: good overtaking opportunities in turns 1 and 4, some fast sweepers like turns 5 and 6 or 12 and 13, and a corner that you will never get right like turn 9 that leads into turn 10, where you most likely will lock up every time you're trying to go fast. The only thing that the track is lacking is character. It's an asphalt desert in the middle of another desert. The fact that it became a night race from 2014 onwards gave it sort of a character, but it could be much worse. Qatar. Still a very good track, so we're going with another A. Belgium, Spa-Francorchamps. Well, I mean, everything positive that can be said about the track has been said so many times before, so let's keep it short. Great racing, iconic corners, great challenge, but I have to say, for me, there's a better circuit, to which we'll come later, of course, because there's a track that does some things a little better than Spa. For example, overtaking on the Camel Straight is a little too easy for me, and the last sector is a little too easy for these modern cars as well. It's just pretty much flat out, and the bus stop isn't too much fun. But that's just some small issues with an otherwise great track, so it would be rude to give it anything else but an S. Brazil next, and here we have another iconic venue, the Autodromo José Carlos Pache. I mean, I've pretty much only rated tracks positively for the entire video, and I'm afraid I can't stop now. It's a short but great track that you wouldn't want to miss in the calendar or in the game. Great racing, great and fun to drive corners, and great for battling into the Senna S, where you can try the occasional Daniel Ricciardo trademark dive bomb with your tires locking up the downhill braking zone, only to defend your position in the following straight. What follows, this is a set of challenging corners and then some little too slow for my liking corners that are a little challenging but shouldn't give you much trouble. But once you're done with the unspectacular technical bit, the high-speed chase towards the finish line is your reward, and although I was split between an S and an A, I'm still going with an S, just for the great fun that the fast bits of the track provide you. Well, this track is kind of a mixed bag for me. I really liked it when I started playing the F1 games, but it's got more and more boring with the years for me. Sometimes it just feels like a straight with a couple of chicanes and, of course, a hairpin, so that you can make it back towards the finish line. Of course, the street circuit-like character with the walls close to the edge of the track really adds to the excitement, and the racing there is good, no doubt, but I wouldn't rank it higher than B, as it's still a solid track, just a little bland compared to other tracks that I've rated higher. Okay, I've mostly said positive things about the most tracks we've looked at so far, and this may change here. Sure, it has its unique elements, this weird, steadily getting slower first couple of corners, but I wouldn't really call that a good bit. And then there's the best bit of the track, the fast corners 7 and 8, and the ultra long right-hander that leads to the far too long straight, but at least that corner feels very good. The rest is not terrible really. You've got some good overtaking spots in the hairpins that are turns 6 and 14, maybe even turn 1, but this track is one of those that hurt Herman Tilke's reputation, as he produced some really good tracks like Bahrain or Sepang, to which we'll come later, but then there's lots of this early 21st century modern track shit that is uninspired and pretty forgettable, of which the Shanghai International Circuit is a good example. It's far from a terrible track, that's for sure, but it's just, well, forgettable, and this is why this is the first C I have to give any track. Oh boy, here we go, now it gets controversial. The Circuit Paul Ricard in France. Now, this track gets a lot of hate, and I think it's unjustified. This is just because the race in 2019 was terrible, as, well, this track requires an extremely balanced car that needs to tick all the boxes, and, well, only Mercedes had done that the last couple of years, and, well, guess what? The one year we had two very good cars, we had a very good race there, just as I expected. The track itself is pretty good, and for me it's fun to drive as well. Of course it has its flaws, for example the runoff, which does nothing more than trying to give you a stroke, and the last two turns as well as turn 5 are completely ruining the otherwise very nice flow, but that's it. The rest, in my opinion, is actually very good. The first chicane is an absolute blast, as well as is turn 10, especially when going side by side, which you can and most likely will in many situations, and turn 11 is a welcome challenge that feels great if you absolutely nail it. Racing there works absolutely fine as well. If you just change the runoff in a more traditional way, you'd have a pretty good track, and as it is right now, I'd still give it a B, which is absolutely fine. Now go ahead and roast me in the comments. Here's another first. The first track that isn't in the current game, but will hopefully make a return in a future game. Now it's hard for me to judge this track in an unbiased way, as it's my home track. I've been there many times and I can almost walk the track from where I live, but it is true that Hockenheim has been neutered with the abolishing of the old high-speed circuit through the forest that was almost faster than Monza, and it has lost its character nowadays. However, there's still bits of it left. The stadium section, which feels great to drive through if you're not Sebastian Vettel, as you'll constantly be reminded of your crushed dreams of winning a title with Ferrari. And then there's the first turn, which is quite challenging to get absolutely right without leaving the track. I also like the parabolica that leads towards one of the best overtaking spots of any racetrack, the Spitzkehre, in which you could try to go 3 wide and which is great fun at the first lap of the race. And you can still go side by side afterwards to test who is more daring to take the position into turn 7 and maybe the turns afterwards as well. With the old track still in place, it would be at least an A, but I still want to give it a B as it's still a decent track and one that is especially good for racing. Another German track that unfortunately has not been in the game since 2013, but maybe we could get that in the future as well. The Nürburgring. It hurts me to say this as I am hugely biased in favor of my local boy the Hockenheimring, but for just driving, the Nürburgring is the superior track as it has lots more elevation changes and some really fun to drive corners, for example turns 6 and 7, 11 and 12 and the sweeper that's turn 13. And it's not bad for racing either, with the final chicane ahead of the last corner and especially with turn 1 the downhill hairpin that can catch you out if you brake too late, but brake too early and you may even give your position away. One huge flaw though is the Mercedes arena in my point of view. It's just useless. It completely disrupts the flow of a great to drive track and thus I'll give the Nürburgring another A. Don't think it would have made the S rating without the arena anyway though, as it's not that brilliant. On what we can agree though, we need a German track back, please, no matter which one it is. If it's not possible to race there because both tracks are broke, at least let us have them in the game, Codies. Can't you just do it like you did with China this year, put it in the game anyway this year, even though it's not on the real calendar? I mean, you wouldn't even have a lot of work with Hockenheim, you've got a version from 2019 lying around somewhere, just take the AA money and buy the license from the Hockenheimring. Can't be too expensive since I know their money struggles. Just give us German fans something to enjoy, please. Okay, that was quite the monologue. Now the Hungaroring. Let's make it a little shorter. This one is quite the other way around for me, like it was with Canada. I absolutely didn't like it for many years, but I've developed some sort of liking for it. It is very technical, that's true, but mostly in a fun way, apart from maybe the penultimate corner and that stupid chicane. Racing other cars definitely is hard there, no doubt about that, but it is possible and a fight will probably go for a couple of corners, and if you pull off an overtake it's probably one of the more satisfying ones, as you actually have to work for it and can't just let DRS do the job for you. Spa, China. It's especially great fun with Formula 2 cars as they feel a little more fitting to the pretty narrow track than the F1 cars, but nevertheless it definitely is a great track in my opinion, so let's go with yet another A. Another trip back to time and we're visiting India. F1 raced there for the brief time between 2011 and 2013. That means I unfortunately could never experience this track with a wheel on an F1 game, but I kinda always liked this one and I'm sure I'd enjoy it even more with a wheel since the track is actually one of Tilke's better works. Overtaking opportunities are plenty with turns 1, 3 and 4, but what makes it great for me actually is the technical part of the track that begins with turn 5. It's challenging, at least with a gamepad, but in a good way, and it has a really nice flow. The long and fast turn 10 feels especially great, and interest in a return to India is definitely there, so if they can improve the infrastructure, which was the main reason for F1's departure, we may see a return of this track in the future, and this would definitely be a welcome one. This one is yet another A for me. Imola. This one made its long anticipated return in F1 2021, and it's here to stay for at least another year, and you know what, I don't mind that. Though Imola will never be my favorite Italian track, it actually isn't even top 2 because of how Mugello is just too great, and I prefer Monza to this one as well, but that doesn't mean Imola is no good. The competition in Italy is just immense. Imola has one big issue for me, and I don't really know how to express it. For me, it feels like F1 has outgrown Imola. The track is a little too narrow, and the spaces in between chicanes that are purely there to decrease speed for these ultra-high downforce cars, it feels more like a relic of the past, with the only corners really challenging in my opinion are the second bit of the Variante Villeneuve and of course Acqua Minerali, which is a great corner though. The rest, apart from the horrible Variante Alta, is fine, but more in a time trial and less in racing conditions. But this track is a blast with Formula 2 cars. It feels like it was made for these. With less downforce and harder to drive cars, everything gets me back to this old school racing feeling, whilst with F1 it feels like you take your smartphone back to the 90s, which is probably kind of fun but feels just unnatural. But F2 in Imola is a match made in heaven. So for Formula 1 I'd give this track a B, for Formula 2 I'd give it an S, so let's just meet in the middle and have another A. And we stay in Italy for the Temple of Speed, Monza. Well, Temple of Speed, that says everything you need to know. Pedal to the floor and race each other as hard as you can. That's all that Monza is about, and it's great. Of course, it's not that challenging, but it's still great in its own special way. Just going flat out, just having to brake for a couple of chicanes is absolutely fine once in a while, and the racing there is excellent too. As an added bonus to that, you have Ascari, which actually is quite a challenge to nail and satisfying to get it right, and the Parabolica isn't bad either. So if there's nothing to really criticize, there's just one choice. Get up into S tier, mate. And we're off to another banger. Suzuka is great. Most of the corners are an absolute thrill, especially the S's of course, but also the Dagnas if you get them right. And let's not forget 130R, that full speed left kink that leads to the best overtaking spot, the last chicane, which is one of the few proper braking zones in this very fast and flowing track. You can overtake into turn 1 as well. Both spots require guts too, so there's no free overtakes here either. You have to work for it again, but that's also something that makes this track great. Have another S. Another track that F1 raced on only briefly is the Korean International Circuit. This one is quite difficult to rank as I don't remember much of it, but that probably isn't a good thing to start with, but it can't be absolutely terrible either then. Probably just another forgettable Tilkedrome, and that probably most likely is the case. Well, we got a couple of long straights into hard braking zones, that's okay, and then there's a pretty nice technical part that in some parts has kind of a nice flow going on, but it's still weirdly forgettable, and even though I can't really put down on why that is the case. And then there's no landmarks whatsoever, as this was built into some rice fields in the middle of nowhere. There were plans to build a city around this track, but that obviously never happened, as it's a pretty stupid idea anyways. So let's give it another average treatment with a C, as it's just as forgettable, even though it still is kind of a nice racetrack, but well, I can't put myself giving this one a higher rating. My heart is bleeding as I am now painfully remembered what's been missing from the calendar for 4 years now. The Sepang International Circuit. This is a testament of what Tilke can do if he really puts an effort. An absolute banger and one of the, if not the best racetrack he ever created. It is broad enough for modern cars to properly race. The runoff isn't too easy on you, as it is on a lot of more modern racetracks, and every corner makes sense. It's not just a combination of uninspired 90-degree corners, hairpins or chicanes. There's not one I can point out that's terrible or not so good. Sure, some like turn 11 and turn 14 are challenging, but in a good way, and driving there is fun, but racing there is too. Especially in the first sector, where you may see cars going side by side for many corners until one gets the edge over another. Let's just put it simple, this is an absolute S, nothing less. Please also let us have that one back, Codies. And on we head to Mexico. Initially I was a big fan of the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez when it returned in 2015, but that euphoria kinda died out. In the game, I still have memorable and fun races here still to this day, as the 2 long straights and the chicanes that precede each of them make for great battling opportunities, but the rest is kinda meh. The S's are kinda cool, like most of those corner combinations are, but they are rather one of the worst or more forgettable of their kind. The stadium section offers great atmosphere, and it's great for that, as it's truly a unique feature that I actually like from that point of view, but driving through there is painful. It's just a terrible bit of track if you just drive it without regard to the atmosphere. The weird hairpin after the second chicane is also not so good. All in all, it feels like a worse version of Monza. Racing here is good, and the track is not terrible either. Its great atmosphere and the great races and battles you can have here save it a B rating. Here it is, the jewel in the crown, and well, it just belongs in the calendar no matter how bad racing here can be. It still remains the biggest challenge in the F1 calendar. Nelson Piquet probably described driving here the best. It's like trying to ride a bicycle in your living room. And that fits it very, very well. Now, I found it very hard to rate this one as it's so different. I always enjoyed driving here in most of the F1 games, however, in F1 2021 it probably became my most hated track, as it became so hard for me to drive cleanly here that it's nearly impossible to race here. And properly racing other cars here never really was fun, ever. I still enjoy the challenge though, because if you nail everything, which was much easier in earlier games, somehow it feels like the greatest track ever. But now it just feels probably how it feels in real life, a relic of the past that isn't suitable for Formula 1 anymore. I still give it a C, as qualifying and time trials still are really enjoyable, and well, it's Monaco. What else can you say? And now we arrive to one of the latest additions to the F1 calendar, although this track isn't really new. We are in Zandvoort in the Netherlands. There have been slight modifications to make this track suitable for F1, but that didn't change any of its character. In fact, the banked corners only made it better for me. Now, this track also is a little too small and narrow for Formula 1 still, but somehow it doesn't really feel like that for me, as much as that's the case in Imola and Monaco, for example. It still feels like it fits. The only big flaw I have is that racing and overtaking is pretty hard, if not impossible sometimes. There's 2 kinda longer straights with DRS zones. The first one on the start and finish is probably the best or only overtaking spot, as you can carry high speed and follow the car ahead through the banked final corner. And that works quite well, even most of the time only because the AI doesn't realize that you can push the overtake button in the final corner already and don't have to wait for the straight, but even then it sometimes is the case, like it always is in the second DRS zone. The next corner comes far too early to make a move. Still, I get great enjoyment out of driving this track, so let's give it another A. Next we head to Portugal, and this is a brand new track from F1 2021. And remember what I said talking about Spa? This one is the track that I think is the best in the game. It probably is the best track built in this century, the best modern track in the F1 games and the best in all of the F1 games for me. It offers everything with its challenging and unique corners. It is great fun just going at it in time trial, but racing here is also brilliant. You can race here, and what's the best about it is that it isn't as easy to overtake as it's in Spa or Monza. You actually have to work a little bit for it, and it's not too hard like in Hungary or well Zandvoort, where you have to rely on your opponents making little mistakes or just having a much faster car. It just does everything so well that it comes close to being the perfect racetrack for me. It's a fun roller coaster that is just so brilliant to drive in a modern F1 car. This is an absolute S-tier track for me. Considering that we probably won't see any Portuguese racetrack in F1 games anymore, and we only had 2 games with a Portuguese track ever, it is surprising to actually see 2 different tracks from the same country. The second and probably most forgotten track from any F1 game is the Circuito do Estoril, the classic one without the weird changes to the old Turn 8. This was one of the 4 classic tracks in F1 2013 and one of the 2 that were only included in a DLC. And what can I say, this one is very good too. I mean, you instantly realize that this has to be a classic track, as it is very narrow, even more than the Hungaroring, and runoff is pretty small as well, as this track in general had to be fitted in a small spot, but for that it's great. Challenging track, unique turns, and little to no room for error. A little too narrow for properly good racing though. So this is another A. For the next one, we'll be heading to Russia for one of the most hated tracks in the current F1 calendar, the Sochi Autodromo. And I get it, most of the races there, especially the on-track racing, was kinda meh, except 2021, obviously, and this track is such a weird one as it's supposed to be a street circuit, which it actually isn't. I don't know, it's just weird. It's an asphalt desert in the middle of the deserted 2014 Winter Olympics venues. Not really a permanent racetrack, but not a street circuit either. Anyway, I kinda enjoyed in the game. Not to the level that I'd call it one of my favorite tracks, but still kinda good, and you get some good fun and good racing from it in the game. However, while the first 2 sectors are kinda good, or at least okay, and I get some enjoyment driving them in the game, the last one is just painful. So this one gets a C from me. I'm very much looking forward to Igora Drive from 2023 onwards, as that one looks pretty good and actually being a brand new permanent track being added to Formula 1. Here's the latest addition to the F1 calendar, for which they threw away their values and chose the sweet Saudi oil money, but the truth is, in the game, the track is an absolute banger. Now don't get me wrong, this track looks like some fictional racetrack from Gran Turismo or Forza, in a very good way, like a track that would never exist in reality as it would be much too dangerous. The atmosphere is crazy, very futuristic and nice to look at. Was a little different in reality, as things and buildings weren't 100% finished yet, but it is just great in the game. Exciting track, very fast, very flowing, no room for error, and just amazing. I can't help but give it an S, as this is what it deserves. However, I don't think F1 should race here. A, because of the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, which is an entirely different debate, as F1 shouldn't race in many other venues as well because of that. But hey, money talks. But most importantly, F1 shouldn't race here because it's too dangerous. These speeds, paired with little to no runoff and blind corners, it's just waiting for tragedy to happen. We've seen many accidents, both in F1 and F2, that could have ended with drivers getting seriously injured or worse, had they just turned out a little different, or had other drivers not reacted very well, not to T-bone any wrecked cars being thrown back onto the track. This is not suitable for F1 and racing here should remain in the virtual world. Okay, the next one is kinda controversial as well. The Marina Bay Street Circuit in Singapore. For some, it's a street racing snooze fest, for others it's a modern classic. I count myself to those who think the latter. I actually think this one would be a good replacement for Monaco as the jewel in the crown, as it's a street race in a very special venue, plus it is a night race. Actually, it was the first night race being added to the F1 calendar. And opposite to Monaco, overtaking is possible. Hard, but possible. And opposite to Jeddah, which we talked about just before that, it's a proper street circuit. Like they're supposed to be, not a fucking death trap. We've seen some great fights in the midfield in the last couple of years here, and you can have these battles in the game as well. The track is a proper challenge like a street race should be. Minus points have to be awarded for many 90-degree turns, but that's just what street circuits are like, usually when they are not artificially built and not waiting to kill a driver. For the lack of flow, I can't give this one a real high rating, and I don't see myself putting this over Baku, but I really like it. It gets a B from me. Together with Baku, this is the best F1 street circuit in my opinion, with the exception of Jeddah, as I've explained before. Spain will be the only country with 3 entries in this list, so let's get going with this one. The first one is the Circuit de Barcelona-Catalunya. This one is the holder of the Spanish Grand Prix since 1992, and for modern F1 it is probably the best choice of the 3 we are about to see. It's big enough and racing is definitely possible, at least in the game. The first 2 sectors of this track are very good, a straight A racetrack for me, but as soon as you enter the 3rd sector you'll get depressed just thinking how good this track could be if that sector wouldn't exist. Tight, slow and annoying are probably the best words to describe that part of the track. The first hairpin already being a pain in the ass, which will get better in the next game since they changed it into a quicker, wider corner that won't offer any overtaking chances, but at least it is more enjoyable to drive. Then the next corners aren't particularly great as well, but the absolute worst is the ridiculous chicane ahead of the final corner. Now, prior to 2007, the last 2 corners were very fast and exciting right-handers, but that is just shit. Probably the worst corner of all the tracks. It absolutely disrupts any flow that was left after that final sector, and it makes overtaking unnecessarily hard on the main straight that will follow, especially in real life. Now if they find a fix for this in the future, just like they kinda did with the hairpin into the final sector, this might get an A or at least a B. The first 2/3 of the track save this one a C, as the last sector would be a flippin' F all on its own. The next one is another classic from the 2013 Classic Edition, the Circuito de Jerez in its classic version without the chicane in the last sector. This one is really enjoyable, just like Estoril, which we talked about earlier. It's a nice and fast flowing track with many, well, fast and flowing corners. You also realize that it's a classic track just like Estoril, as it's very tight and modern cars couldn't possibly go wheel-to-wheel racing there, as there is no straight that's long enough, so don't even consider going back here, but just for the fun it is to just drive here and race with classic cars, this one gets an A. The final Spanish track is another street circuit, the Valencia Street Circuit, which held the European Grand Prix from 2008 to 2012, and while I consider Baku and Singapore very good modern street circuits, this one is a stinker. Now, just hearing Valencia Street Circuit, things might sound interesting, as you think, well, Valencia is a very beautiful city, so why not hold a street race there? Well, 2 things. Valencia has a permanent racetrack that F1 could have gone to, and second, it's not really in the city, more like in an industrial harbor, and therefore the atmosphere is, how do I put this? Well, it's crap. The track itself isn't much better either, not much character, and well, it's very forgettable. It's like an even worse version of Sochi, and while worse versions of very good tracks may still be somewhat enjoyable, worse versions of tracks that aren't particularly great in the first place absolutely suck eggs. I kinda like driving there in the older F1 games, but after revisiting it now, I can't really rate it higher than Monaco. That would be a crime. Sorry Valencia, but you'll get the first D of the day. This track received a lot of hype in the last 2 years after it came in as a surprise substitute for other races in the past 2 seasons that couldn't be held because of COVID-19. And what can I say? It deserves the hype. It is a very good track, one of the better ones created by Hermann Tilke. Good racing, iconic and challenging corners, and generally just a very good racetrack. Unfortunately, we've not had it in the game since 2011, when it was for the last time officially part of the F1 season ahead of the season, not just as a substitute. And now don't get me wrong, it's a very good racetrack and I love to see it in the game, but I kind of feel like it's getting a little overhyped lately. It is very good, but it's not on the same level as Spa or Silverstone, which is how I feel people treat it lately. It still has too much of the Tilkedrome feeling for me, but well, that's just my opinion. It absolutely deserves an A, no doubts about that. We head deep into the Middle East for the third time now for a track that isn't too popular with F1 fans at all, because it isn't really that good, and even worse, it is the final race of the season for a long time to go because of Arab oil money. And that angers many fans, as most races here are pretty boring, admittedly, and well, it needed a little help from Michael Masi being overwhelmed as a race director to provide an exciting season finale this year, to give us an exciting but farcical show in the final lap for the title decision. God damn it, why didn't you just red flag this shit, Michael? I'm still not over these weird decisions having taken place and ruining or at least overshadowing such a great season in the end. Check the video in the top right corner if you want to hear me rant a little more about that race. Now back to the track itself. The good news is it got improved this year, at least from a driving perspective. The racing didn't change too much, but overtaking was already possible in the earlier years, as all those midfield battles proved. The bad news is we don't have these changes in the game yet. The first bit of the track, everything until turn 4, is pretty good. Then we have a disruptive chicane and a way too tight hairpin, and then at least some good overtaking opportunities on the following straights that allow nice battles and good counters for cars being overtaken earlier. And then, well, the rest is absolute crap. We'll get a nice corner at the second DRS straight next game though, and the disruptive chicane will be removed as well. That will improve the track, definitely, but the last sector will still remain crap, just like it's the case in Barcelona. And we gave that a C earlier, and well, this track being even worse, as we don't have 2/3 of the track being great, this track will receive an even worse rating. This one will get another D. The last track from the 2013 Classic Edition is the Brands Hatch circuit in the United Kingdom. This is the one where F1 hasn't raced for the longest of all of these tracks, and you get that by just looking at it. If any track here deserves the not suitable for modern F1 stamp, it's this one. It remains unchanged today, opposed to all of the others, and still is used for GT and touring car racing. And for those purposes, it's a great racetrack, and I totally get why so many people like it. However, I never really loved that track. I have neither any really positive nor negative feelings for it. It's just a little boring to me. And I don't know why, because in theory it's a track that I should really like, with nice, fast and flowing corners, but I guess the lack of proper braking zones kinda kills it for me. I mean, a couple of right-hand sweepers is great, but if that's pretty much the entire track, that's just not good enough for me. One hairpin and only one left turn that is actually requiring you to do something apart from slightly turning the wheel is just not enough for me to make a good racetrack. But I get the charm of Brands Hatch in theory, so it's still a B. Though personally, it would only be a C for me. Silverstone, the home of Formula 1. The first F1 championship race took place here in 1950, and though the Silverstone circuit has undergone many changes since then, it's still one of the best racetracks on the calendar. And the most remarkable thing for me is, it does so without elevation change like Portimao or Spa, without it being a spectacular venue like Baku, Singapore or Monaco, as it's built on an old World War II airfield. It is just a great circuit for driving and racing. It does that probably in the best way of any track without those extras mentioned earlier. Despite not having these characteristics, it plays in the same league, and that is remarkable. And although I was very skeptical of the changes made to the track in 2010, they actually improved racing and driving here. This deserves nothing but the straight S. One of the top 3 tracks in the F1 games, definitely for me. For the penultimate track, let's head to the USA, to the Circuit of the Americas. This is yet another track designed by Hermann Tilke, and it's not hard to realize that. And that usually means nothing terrible, but probably nothing too great either. And well, what can I say? This is exactly what I think about the Circuit of the Americas, or at least about the track itself. Tilke attempted kind of a best-of of popular tracks and corners, and whilst a lot of corners are pretty good, like the triple right-hander in the final sector, or the S's at the beginning of the track, or the uphill hairpin that is turn 1, it also has those weird and strange forgettable slow corners that kinda disrupt the flow and are a little annoying to me. So the track itself gets an average B from me, but that being said, I hope F1 will stay here. It seems like after a very long and painful search, F1 has finally found its home in America, with sellout crowds and great fans here. The venue is really great. Please don't risk that with oversaturating the market with strange venues like the one in Miami we'll see for the first time next year. This feels just like all of those disasters of races in Detroit, Phoenix, Las Vegas and wherever F1 went to in the 80s and 90s, with none of these venues being really good or popular with fans or drivers. By the way, speaking of F1 venue disasters, the Hanoi Street Circuit is F1's latest fail in terms of this. In the original 2020 calendar, before all that COVID-19 stuff happened, we were supposed to race in Vietnam for the first time ever. Now, because of COVID, this obviously never happened in 2020 and the debut race was delayed. In the meantime, their organizer got arrested for corruption and now this race will probably never go ahead, although a lot of money has been spent to create all venues and accommodation for F1, as well as a permanent part to the circuit that isn't running on public roads. So theoretically, this track really exists and F1 could race here, but it probably never will, as well as the organizer is in jail and there's no new organizers on the horizon. But at least in the 2020 game we have that track, and well, I guess it would actually be kinda good for real F1, as the racing there could really be good without having the potential for disaster, like Jeddah for example. It could provide races like we had in Baku, for example. However, from the fun that could be had at this track, I have to say the final sector is quite good with these S's. Final corners are kind of weird, but that would be okay if the rest of the track would be good, and oh my, it really isn't. Long straights that partly aren't really straights, leading into way too tight hairpins, and worst of all, 2 fucking roundabouts. These stupid roundabout corners are the worst thing I have ever seen on a racetrack. Forget what I said about the chicane in Barcelona. These 2 are the worst corners on an F1 circuit for me. And while these really slow corners just destroy any possible flow because you have to wait for ages to press the accelerator again, the worst part is that in both occasions there is a concrete wall on the right bending into the racing line, just waiting to clip off your front wing in a best case scenario and ripping your entire tire apart in a realistic and worst case scenario. I just hate that track. And I'm glad that it probably will never ever be in an F1 game ever again. The first and one and only E goes to the Hanoi Street Circuit. Congratulations to the guy in jail, although he didn't technically design the track, so I guess congratulations to Herman Tilke instead. I defended you many times, but this time you've gone one too far. I'm out of here. Do whatever you like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want to see more, and leave your opinion or your own ranking in the comments. And please remember, this is just my opinion. You're free to have your own. We are not in Bahrain, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, China, or whatever here. Please just stay civilized. Goodbye.